Hello, welcome to another Mundane Monday. I'm Sally Ducharme. It is Monday, March 27th, 2023. And my question for you today is, have you had your Saturn return yet? This is a concept that's become kind of mainstream. This is a point when Saturn comes back around to the point in your chart where it was when you were born. It happens approximately every 29 years or so. And so people will sometimes say, I'm having my Saturn return, like, the doom is coming upon me. When actually, our experience with the Saturn return is pretty much unique to us. There are as many different responses to a Saturn return as there are people having a Saturn return. However, certain themes related to Saturn do run through this time in our lives. Saturn, very much about responsibility, obligation. This might feel fairly heavy at this time in our lives. Also, we've got the concept of limitation. We might just feel like our lives have become constricted in some way, which is another Saturn theme. And also, too, Saturn is kind of our teacher. There are things we need to learn by facing difficulties and challenges. And so that can come along at this time in our lives as well. But I think the most important role of a Saturn return in our lives is to create a kind of threshold we cross into a new phase of life. We live our lives, for example, in 3 chapters. And chapter 1 really ends at that first Saturn return. I have this little chart I'll pull up here to show kind of the first chapter before our Saturn return is about childhood, young adulthood, self-development. And it doesn't mean that you won't find your career or find the person you eventually marry at this time, but you are still in very much this kind of self-focused time of development. Chapter 2 begins after our Saturn return, and this is really crossing the threshold into adulthood. This is where our lives become pretty much limited through our work, family, a lot of obligations. You think about most of the work in the world is done by people in this second chapter of life. And then we begin a third chapter in our late 50s. And we're starting to move away from work. If we're raising families, that's starting to disperse. Children are growing up. And it's a time when we're stepping into a whole new chapter of life, when obligations from that second chapter are fading, and we're starting to discover some things, some untapped gifts. But also, this is a time when we're stepping into elderhood. I know people don't always like to hear that term when they're only in their late 50s, but it is true that if you're in a workplace, you're the person who's kind of a resource for other people. That you might find yourself talking with younger people just about your life experiences and sharing them. And so there's that sense of elderhood and also creating a kind of legacy. And while you think, well, gosh, that's a lot to fall on me at 58, remember, this is nearly a 30-year cycle. It carries us through our late 80s. And some people are graced with more time and do move into a 4th chapter following that third Saturn return. So I haven't reached that yet, so I'll tell you about it when and if I get there. So in any case, this is a time when we are looking at crossing thresholds, starting a new phase of life. And so as I looked at the movie John Wick 4 that came out this past week, I thought, oh my goodness, this is really the story of someone at his second Saturn return. Now, granted, John Wick is a fictional character, and so we don't know exactly when he was born, but there are themes running through his life at this point that very much signal that this is a Saturn return threshold he's crossing. He's very, very heavy under obligation and debt, with the high table controlling his life. So that sense of oppression, that sense of limitation, and facing this big challenge, of confronting them and the tasks he needs to do in this film, very much kind of the imperative of that second Saturn return. And then finally, in this movie, we do see that he's moving into a mentor role, trying to help, someone from the next generation kind of deal with kind of this crazy assassin world that he is negotiating throughout the films. And so while we see that, I won't give any spoilers about what happens at the end, but just there is a very Saturnian end to the to the movie, but that sense of he's leaving behind a legacy, very much Saturn Return. And if you look at the promotional poster for the movie, I mean, it just seems to scream Saturn, because we've got the color of Saturn is black, so all the darkness just shrouding John Wick here. The somber look in his eyes just looks like a man who's just experienced deeply. And then one thing that's interesting, I don't know if you can see this in the picture, but his tie is an hourglass, that sense of time running out with John Wick. So I just love that for someone who's enacting the part of a second Saturn return, how much this picture mirrors the whole imagery around a second Saturn return, and how absolutely fascinating that the actor playing John Wick is on his own, in his own life, according to his own chart, experiencing his second Saturn return. Keanu Reeves has his Saturn. We'll pull up his chart at 1 degree of Pisces. You can see it over here. And so, interestingly enough, the movie was supposed to come out last year. No, I think in 2021, actually, 2 years ago, when Saturn was still in Aquarius. But due to limitations and delays, again, all very Saturnian things, it was not released in the US until just last week. I think it was released a little earlier, I think in England, but still at the point when Saturn was just moving into Pisces, and when it was actually released in the US, it was as Keanu Reeves' Saturn return point here. So this is very fascinating. Not only is the actor who's playing a Saturn return character having his second Saturn return, but it's in Pisces, the sign of the movies. So he's playing it, projecting it through the movies themselves. And so trying to understand our Saturn return when we were having our second Saturn return, it's always interesting to look back at what was going on at our first Saturn return. So I did a little research on Keanu Reeves to see what was happening in 1994 when that Saturn was coming back to his natal position in his chart. And I read an interview with him at the time. He was playing Siddhartha in a movie called Little Buddha. And while he had a few serious roles before then, he was still kind of basically known as Ted in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. So this was kind of an eye-opener for him to play such a deep philosophical character. He said the things he learned playing that character about the power of suffering in lives, and just that sense of, that we're constantly trying to find peace at the center of this very painful world, was something that he learned at that time that has stayed with him ever since. So those very Saturnian, somber lessons. And if we go to understand his Saturn, we see that it is ruled by Jupiter in his 9th house. So how interesting that at the time of his first Saturn return, he was learning some deep philosophical lessons. And also, if we look at this Jupiter itself, which is in Taurus, so that's a sign that's very basic. I think when he talks, he doesn't talk much about his philosophy, but in interviews, he said that, to alleviate suffering on a practical level, is kind of his spiritual path. It set him off on some very philanthropic endeavors. You can see that strong Cancerian moon in his 11th house, in its own sign. But so he does have a deep empathy for people. Of course, that shows the attraction of an audience to him. But notice that moon is also with Saturn in Cancer and Venus in Cancer. So this is somebody who has that kind of sweetness. And that also, he can play kind of goofy, lovable roles like Ted. And he's also played in some romantic comedies as well. I know he was really funny in the Netflix movie with Ali Wong a few years ago. I'm sorry, I'm trying to recall the name of that movie. But anyway, so he can be very goofy, very funny, but that Mars here too with that moon, someone who loves action as well as romance. It's helped make him the universal movie star that he is. So anyway, this Jupiter is very well supported by its ruler Venus in Cancer. So giving him kind of a strong, solid philosophy of life. It's not like he's too otherworldly. He's more rooted in the here and now. When someone asked him about life after death, he said, well, I know that the people who loved us will miss us after we're gone. So his focus was on really life on earth, not too much delving into his spiritual beliefs other than, being kind to each other while we are on this planet. And so we've got then that Saturn return coming back into place when he's 29 years old, turning 30, and just kind of waking him up to some philosophical truths in life. But notice what else is happening in that with that Saturn. He was born kind of a super Virgo, you can see here, with the Sun and Mercury retrograde together in Virgo. But he was also born at a time when Uranus and Pluto were forming a conjunction, that mid-60s, when it was a time of rebellion that is kind of like the component parts of society, which had been isolated, shoved aside, were starting to rebel and saying to create a more just world, we need to have civil rights. We need to have women's rights. We need to have gay rights. We need to include everyone. So that's really the dynamic of Pluto floating through Pisces in these years in the mid-60s, opposing the Virgo planets. So this kind of breaking down with the Uranus-Pluto of the way society is organized to build over here, Saturn in Pisces, a more compassionate, inclusive society. And so you can see Keanu Reeves would very much incorporate that dynamic in his own life. And also through his movie roles, coming back to that Saturn in Pisces. Notice that he has played rebels, people who are kind of fighting against the system, that Uranus-Pluto. Also very techno type of roles that he's played in the past. You think, of course, the Matrix, creating a whole universe of, kind of an imagined, artificially constructed world, and the technology that is involved in that. And so you can see that all of these Virgo planets were awakened at the same time, kind of opening him up to new types of movie roles. And the role that was most significant at his Saturn return was the movie Speed, when he shaved his head, went to the gym and bulked up. All of these things, Saturn opposite to the first house, and became kind of your traditional action star in the movie Speed. And so at his first Saturn return, then he not only kind of did some philosophical searching and grounded himself, but he also kind of looked at his image and what he needed to do, what tasks he needed to take on in order to develop that body and persona that he wanted to project through movies, again with the second Saturn return. And so also we notice just about his life when someone has Saturn opposite Sun, that it could be some issues around the father. And we know from his biography that his father left the family when he was 3 years old. He was raised by a single mother, though I think he had a number of stepfathers along the way too, some of whom were very helpful. And so that kind of isolation from the father, again, a Sun Saturn theme. Also, of course, a theme coming through John Wick as well, since he was an orphan at the beginning of the story. And also he's had some tragedy around becoming a father himself. He lost a child. He and his partner had a stillborn child a few years after his Saturn return. And so there's been some sadness in his life around that. But yet he has people with Sun Saturn have to learn to become their own father. And so you can see in the growth and progression of his life as he's moved from, just sort of an happy-go-lucky actor to a very committed performer. He tends to, Virgo style, draw out directors who are known for their excellence. And he emphasizes that over, and the quality of the movie over his own ego. He's even been known to give up salary so that they could heighten the special effects in a film. So he doesn't go into a movie project wondering about his payday. He wonders first about, who's making this? What is it going, is it going to be a truly excellent, good word from Bill and Ted movie? And so that's been his priority all along. And so that's really starting to happen at that first Saturn return. And so we've seen him come now at his second Saturn return into creating another really good movie. And he said he'll continue to play John Wick as long as the movies are successful. That he doesn't want to be part of a dying franchise, but he's very supportive of keeping this franchise going, although that's a little bit of a question given the end of the film. So anyway, what is ahead for him now? He'll be having his second Saturn return throughout this year. Saturn is moving up to 7 degrees of Pisces and moving back to 0 by the end of this year. And so his second Saturn return will be going from March to January of 2024. And so I know that I just looked at his Wikipedia page and see that he is kind of stepping forward as a producer of a series called Conquest that's going to be on Netflix. He's also written some books with his partner. So interesting that Saturn here at the 7th house. And she, I guess, is a very creative person, and he writes the texts that go with her photographs and pictures. He's also written a comic book series that he is going to play the main character in. So you can see that he is trying to become more of the creative person behind the roles. Just as he's admired all these directors over the years, he is stepping forward at this point in his life to create, his own work. And he's trusting himself more as an artist and creator. So here at that second Saturn return, taking on some significant challenges so that he can grow and really create products that will give other actors coming up amazing roles to play. So I think that, and of course, we can't know too much about a personal life of a celebrity. So whatever happens throughout his Saturn return, second Saturn return over the next year, will probably be between him and the people he's close to. But we just, throughout this next year, wish him well and in all that he does, and say that we will be very much looking forward to the amazing work that he's creating next. So thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week. Bye.